Welcome back to Cracking the Shell on Psychological Science. I'm your host, Mike Doherty, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Desi Jones, a professor of psychology here at the University of Maryland and an expert on the topic of autism. Today, we're diving into an issue that's been dominating the headlines for the last couple of weeks. Does taking acetaminophen, better known as Tylenol, during pregnancy increase the likelihood of a child developing autism or ADHD? What do the data actually say? And are there reasons to be skeptical of claims suggesting a link? Let's find out. Good morning and welcome to the show, Desi.
Hi, Mike. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here and to talk about this with you.
Let's start with the research article in the journal Environmental Health by Didier Prada and colleagues at the Harvard School of Public Health. Now, what were the main findings of this article?
Yeah, so this study, I want to clarify, it's not a meta-analysis. They actually used something called qualitative synthesis, and what they did was they looked at a bunch of different studies that kind of examined Tylenol use and diagnosis of autism, ADHD, and other developmental conditions. So they had 46 studies, they read through them and basically summarized them and summarized the findings. And they found that more of the studies, or most of the studies, tended to report a positive association between Tylenol use and later diagnosis with like autism and ADHD.
It wasn't a meta-analysis, so it was one of these systematic reviews. So they aren't making statistical claims on the basis of this synthesis per se. They're just summarizing statistical claims of various other articles, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that their argument is presented in a very like causal type of way. But then when you look at their actual findings, they say like there may be an association. They make it clear it's not like a cause and effect type of thing. I think that's something that people need to be really careful about when they're reading research like this and interpreting things.
Can you summarize maybe some of the specific claims they're trying to make?
Specifically, they said that when women took Tylenol in the second and third trimesters of pregnancy, they were more likely to give birth to a child who then had a diagnosis of ADHD or autism. Because this was like a broad range of studies, they couldn't pull things together. So, some studies had like actual clinician diagnoses that were reported. Some had parents doing a checklist about symptoms and things like that. Likewise, there wasn't actually a dose-response relationship. This wasn't an experimental study, so they didn't say this woman took this much Tylenol and then her kid was diagnosed. Instead, they just had reports of prescriptions that people were given from registries or self-report retrospectively from parents on how much Tylenol, they reported that they used when they were pregnant.
One of the things that as a methodologist we start to be concerned about are things like, okay, what was the control condition? Well, in this case, there is no control condition because they're just summarizing what are basically mostly correlational studies. Should we get into some of the limitations of this article then?
When I'm teaching students about research, I like to talk about confounders or third variables or things that could impact this relationship. A good fun example that's given is sometimes you see a correlation between ice cream sales and shark attack. And it's not that selling more ice cream causes more sharks to attack people, right? Instead, if you think about it, in the summer, people are eating more ice cream. They're also going to be at the beach swimming more, so they're going to be more likely to eat and buy more ice cream and also more likely to get attacked by a shark. When we look at correlational studies with autism and especially this Tylenol thing, there are a lot of potential confounders that, the authors of this study kind of mention, but they don't really get into them. They can't control for them in their analysis, things like that. So some potential confounders that could actually be contributing to autism. The biggest one is fevers. When women are pregnant and they have a fever, doctors typically prescribe Tylenol for them. That's kind of seen as the safest, most effective treatment. However, fevers during pregnancy actually are linked to the development of many of these neurodevelopmental conditions, or they can basically impact the developing fetus when a mom has a fever. So if a woman has more fevers during pregnancy, that could be the reason that her kid, is born with a neurodevelopmental condition, rather than the Tylenol usage.
And so in some perverse way, right, pulling back on Tylenol could have an adverse effect on the prevalence rates.
Yeah,
if that ends up being, there are many confounders, right? So
yes,
it's not
exactly.
like that's the only one.
Yeah, there's many confounders, but a lot of research has gone into this and found that fevers and maternal sickness during pregnancy can contribute to differences in the child when they're born. Another example is migraines. Women who have more migraines during pregnancy take more Tylenol. However, something could be contributing to the migraines. Maybe the mom has health conditions, things like that.
I don't know if you're going to get into this, but the genetic risk.
We find that autism is pretty heritable, meaning there's a pretty strong genetic component to autism. People who are autistic often have family members who are autistic, things like that. And one really good way to look at heritability, that genetic component, is to do sibling studies.
Okay, so what happens when we control for siblings?
Yep, so there was a big Swedish study that actually did this. They had 2 million families in there, and 1 million of them included siblings. And when they controlled for this sibling relationship, this effect, relationship between Tylenol usage and autism diagnosis, completely disappeared. It was no longer there, no longer significant. And
so the key component of that, sorry to interrupt, but the key component of that one was, if you just looked at the initial analysis of those 2 million families, there appears to be an association. But the key analysis is one that controls for that genetic factor, right? And once that is controlled for, the results go to null, right?
Yes, exactly. And, again, thinking about these third variables and stuff, with genetics, it could be that, autism is associated with a lot of other co-occurring conditions, chronic pain, things like that. If a mom's autistic, or maybe she has some health issues, so she's taking more Tylenol when she's pregnant, things like that, something else could be increasing the Tylenol usage that, isn't actually related to this autism diagnosis, right?
The key thing is when we look at sort of gold standard science, right, the stuff that we really feel like we can trust, we look at 4 studies like the Swedish study that controls for a whole host of confounders. And in this case, it really is, when we're dealing with something that has a heritability component, that has to be controlled for. And so when we control for that, we know those results go to 0. And we should probably add, with 2 million or 1 million families included in the study, this is a very high statistically powered study that we would typically need to detect really small effects. And yet, no measurable relationship. How about we go into some of the other issues that you and I both have about this article? I don't know if you want to start. I have a big one I want to lay out there, but I'll let you start.
Yeah, so I think the one that you're about to say is similar to kind of what I'm thinking on.
Conflict of interest.
Yep, yeah. Exactly. So it's the same classic story that you see, back when people were associating vaccines with autism, there was also a conflict of interest with that researcher.
So you're talking about the Andrew Wakefield study?
Yes.
Okay, so this is the seminal studies that purported, I'm going to use the word purported, to show a relationship between vaccines and the development of autism. It has now, to be clear, been retracted. There were many problems with that. There was allegations, I think substantiated allegations of research misconduct, but there were some other issues that I was unaware of.
Yep, so this was specifically related to the MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, and rubella, and he was saying that combined vaccine was, dangerous and kids shouldn't take it. However, 2 big conflicts of interest weren't disclosed. The first was that he was actually trying to patent a rival vaccine, so he wanted a kind of solo, I think it was measles vaccine, so it was kind of in his best interest to discredit this vaccine that was already out there so that people would use his vaccine. And then the second was he was being paid by lawyers of families who were suing this vaccine maker. Again, he had a lot to benefit from, if this vaccine was discredited.
And that brings us right back to this article, because if you look closely at the byline, the 4th author, arguably the senior author, is a consultant for a law firm that is suing the makers of Tylenol.
So again, having a lot to benefit from potentially. They said this could be seen as a conflict of interest, but I definitely think it's one.
Right. And let's just be honest, disclosing a conflict of interest does not make it go away, especially when there's a substantial financial benefit to be had. And in this case, at least for some of the other reporting I saw, he had made already $150,000 on consulting fees for this law firm. But there's another issue that we wanted to talk about.
Yes, so that's the issue of publication bias, right?
Yes.
So there's another study that came out recently, and researchers actually did a meta-analysis on all of these studies of Tylenol usage, ADHD, and autism. And when they did the meta-analysis, first of all, they didn't find a significant relationship between Tylenol usage and autism. They did find a very small one between ADHD and Tylenol usage. However, they really emphasized that this effect was so small, it could be explained by publication bias. I know this is something that's interesting to you and people who are really interested in open science like us. Basically, for a long time in the field, right, there's been this emphasis where you could only publish significant findings, meaning that most of the research we have out here is ones that show a relationship between things. If people had a paper that showed no significant relationship between Tylenol and ADHD or autism, maybe it was less likely to get published because it didn't have that flashy significant finding.
Right. Not only that, but there is a systematic preference, or historically in journals, for publishing positive findings, right?
Yes.
But it's also the case that I think a lot of authors oftentimes won't even bother to submit that work for publication. So what that means then obviously is that all of those findings out there, or all those studies out there that have looked for an association between, in this case, Tylenol and autism, and failed to find that association, went unpublished. Now, we don't know what that looks like. They are systematically missing from the literature, but it does raise the question about the veracity of the literature. And this, by the way, applies uniformly across science. It's not specific to this one domain. It's just, in this case, the absence of an effect is quite important.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's what the authors of this meta-analysis were really kind of getting at. They said, if even like one or two studies of a null effect weren't published because of this publication bias, it could have swung the results, the other way for this. That's how small this effect was for ADHD. So that's a big problem. And I think we really need to be considerate of it when we're, evaluating the literature out here, especially when, you're looking at trying to make causal inferences, which you really shouldn't be doing without an experimental study anyway.
I want to jump to another topic. We don't have a whole lot more time here left, but I know you've written a lot on stigma towards autistic people. How does this study and the framing of it perpetuate stigma?
Yeah, so I think right now, especially we're in a time where a lot of this discourse around autism is driven by this fear narrative almost, right? So you constantly see these headlines like rising rate of autism diagnoses, 1 in 31 children diagnosed, things like that, and people are really focused on finding a cause of autism. But the way that they do this is very pathologizing. It treats autism as something very risky, something very negative and harmful, the same way you would treat like a disease that people have. They're trying to prevent it, look at ways to cure it, things like that. Another issue is it's like very blame focused. If you're narrowing it down to something like, well, a mom took too much Tylenol when she was pregnant, it's kind of making it so that it's the mom's fault, almost like blaming her for her child being neurodivergent. And that's really harmful, right? I think we need to focus on the people at the other end of it, these families, these actual autistic people who are living their lives. It doesn't do us any, good to focus on things that happened in the past. Instead, I think we should really focus on the autistic people who are here with us today there. And they have a lot of needs and priorities that aren't being met in research. It's really hard for people to get a diagnosis. Even here in Maryland, there can be like a months-long wait list just to get that diagnosis so that you can get the care and services you need, whether that's in school or at work, things like that. I guess my broader message here is that I think instead of focusing on, these kind of tenuous causes of autism that aren't really fully supported by the research, we should really shift the narrative, talk to autistic people and their families, see what their priorities are. These community priorities, I think in all health research is really important, and finding ways to make the lived experiences of autistic people and their families better and as good as they can be, right?
Well, I feel like we could spend another 2 or 3 hours talking about this, but Desi, it's been wonderful having you on the show. I'm glad you could come, and hopefully we can have you back for either an update or some other work that you're doing on this topic.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been really great to talk about.
My pleasure. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.
If you're interested in reading more about this topic, check out the links in the episode description. And if you're pregnant and wondering whether to take Tylenol, the best advice is to consult your doctor. They'll be able to tailor their recommendations to your specific situation. That's it for now. Take care and be well.